Hello, this DCCRD presentation is around the recorded video on child support. It's a video relay call. So I'll just go through explaining the constellation of demands. The goal of the environment was telecommunication access. The participants were a white deaf woman, probably in her 60s, a white hearing man in his 50s, and a white female interpreter, again in her 50s. The environment, each of them was located in a different space. The deaf woman in her home, the male hearing office worker in his office, and the interpreter in what would be considered your usual VRS center setup. The register was consultative. It was a telephone call, inquiry, and exchange of information schema. As opposed to other phone call schemas that might deal with calling a family member or asking for food to be delivered. This was an inquiry and exchange of information. Some of the interpersonal dynamics. The male hearing person was an employee of the Attorney General in the state of Texas, and so as an expert in the content of the information being shared, the information being inquired upon, he held more authority than the caller, the deaf woman. He was a content expert in areas such as child welfare, guardianship, and as a result had a different status, a higher status than the deaf caller, or it would be for any caller. The communication goals he had would include gathering the pertinent information from the caller, mainly through questioning, and also providing procedural and process information. The tone was professional, helpful, and at times I felt he showed empathy to the caller's situation. That empathy plus a number of the comments he made indicated to me that his thought world included how best to resolve this situation for the caller as quickly as possible. The grandmother, the deaf woman, a subordinate in terms of power or status to the Attorney General employee, her communication goal was to inquire about how to pursue a formal process as legal guardian to her grandchildren. She had 2 grandchildren that she and her husband were caring for, the children of her son and daughter-in-law, and so she needed to secure the sufficient child support income for them to support them. And the scenario was that neither of the parents were paying the support at all. So her tone was polite, respectful, but there was also an underlying emotional tone of anxiety due to the economic burden caring for her own grandchildren without sufficient support. There was also a suggestion in some of her comments that a lot of her thought world circles around the conflicting demands that she's encountering, the children's needs and growing needs as they got older, the family's financial constraints, the need and the burden to pursue legal action against her own child to secure the child support. When I viewed the entire scenario, I did not observe any paralinguistic demands. Everything seemed to work well in terms of being able to hear and see. Interpersonal demands for the interpreter. The only thing I observed during the video was that at a couple of moments her microphone got shifted, moved out of the way because of her signing. So she just had to adjust it. And I saw maybe for a microsecond sort of this expression of irritation when it was out of place. But otherwise, throughout the interaction, I did not observe anything that I would have identified as an interpersonal demand. So the main demand that I wish to explore actually happened it happened several times. throughout the entire segment. And that is the demand of each of the speakers overlapping, speaking at the same time. As an example, around the 4-minute mark, there was a segment asking for the address of the parents. They were overlapping. Around 11 minutes and 30 seconds, there was a segment where the John Clark was the Attorney General employee, and he was making calculations saying that $17,000 was owed. He went on to talk about it being a serious issue, and then the grandmother started to speak over top of that. Then there's a segment about 18 minutes about who lives in the home. There was some overlap. And then just another example was around the 22-minute segment about the son doing possible, or the parents, but the son doing possible jail time. So during these, I've kind of bundled these into the one main demand. And the main control used by the interpreter during these instances were to interrupt the speaker during their turn. And this was done either in ASL or English. So if the English person was speaking, then she saw the ASL person say something, she interrupted and started interpreting what that person was saying. And then the reverse was true as well, where the deaf person was signing something and the deaf hearing person started to say something, so she raised her hands and started to interpret. So the positive consequence of that kind of control decision is that the information is being transmitted immediately to the listening person, whether the receiving person, whether it's the deaf or the hearing person. A negative consequence is that the speaker is interrupted and their train of thought is interrupted. And another negative consequence is a speaker confusion. The resulting demands that I saw, there were more than one resulting demand. Some happened at resulting demands happened at the different segments. So in one instance, the resulting demand was that this speaker needed to repeat and reformulate the comment that they were making while they were interrupted. And that was again around the serious issue, that we've got to get this sorted out, kind of that part of the segment. Another one was that there was really an awkward pause. There was the interruption, and the hearing speaker, the John Clark, was speaking. The interruption, the deaf person started to speak, and then there was this awkward pause, wondering whether it's my turn to speak now or not. So that, as I say, happened a number of times throughout the sample. But at the same time, I did want to raise that looking at this sample, this interpreter did use a number of what I perceive to be effective controls in managing the turn taking and preventing overlapping between the two speakers. She just displayed very culturally appropriate signals for each speaker to know when it was their turn or when the other one was starting to speak. For instance, with the deaf person, she would break eye contact. She would put her head down, indicating either she's listening or it's not her turn quite yet. And actually, a lot of these controls were demonstrated over that segment where John Clark says, let me just get a form out here and I'll take down some of this information. And that segment is where many of these ASL appropriate signals were used. The breaking of the eye contact, holding up the one finger. That also happened about 9 minutes and 30 seconds into it, where she was pausing the deaf person, asking her not to go on. That segment about talking about $129 being used or being awarded for support. So she did use the pause finger to have the hearing person finish his piece before going on. She also explicitly indicated that the hearing person is doing what he was doing. She used this sign talking to himself, but explained he was putting down your name and those kinds of culturally appropriate things to let her know he's busy. It's not time to speak, signaling that he is still keeping the floor. In terms of English culturally appropriate controls, what I observed in this segment was the use of prosody. Oh, actually, pardon me, I want to go on a little bit more about the ASL prosody. That was also a good control, effective control, use of facial grammar to show a question. So now it's your turn to go ahead. Sometimes she would even use the question finger to then prompt the turn taking. There was also other facial grammar that was used to show the end of a turn in terms of a comment. Oh, I'm sure we can find that address for the film company. So that's not the facial grammar of a question showing a turn taking, but a comment saying, oh, I'm sure we can. So there were many effective controls used to show the ASL speaker where the signal or cue was for turn taking. Now moving on to the English. As I mentioned before, he didn't obviously have the visual cue to see when the deaf person was signing. So when there was dead space, she needed to cue him. The interpreter needed to cue the hearing speaker when the deaf person was in fact communicating, even though it might be quiet. So in this case, she used English appropriate signals that illustrated, oh, the deaf person is, oh, let me find something to write with. Okay, now I'm ready. Those kinds of cues for the deaf person to hold the floor so that the hearing person didn't continue to speak while the deaf person couldn't attend. She also, I felt, observed effective use of voice pauses using so that signals to the hearing consumer that the deaf person is still in turn. And it also creates time for the interpreter to perceive and process the incoming source language message. So examples of this were about 18 minutes and 45 seconds. This segment sharing how the grandchildren are doing. So as the grandmother was giving information, the interpreter was interpreting and going, and then just adding those voice pauses that cues the hearing person that the deaf person is still speaking. Another example was around the 20-minute mark where there was the segment about help from other agencies and whether the grandmother might like to do that. And she was showing discomfort with the idea of doing that. She was giving kind of a lengthy response that was not fully coherent in her processing of it. The grandmother looked to me trying to find a way to say no without saying no, and trying to do that in a polite way. So her response was, fairly lengthy. But the point I'm trying to make is that the interpreter maintained the turn using these voice pauses as well as effective prosody. She used prosody for the voice to go up to signal the turn was not finished. Example of this was around 18 minutes and 45 seconds, again about how the children were doing. So then she would say also, and so her voice went up, so showing that was as well as that cohesive marker, but showing that the turn was not finished. An example where that didn't seem to work was when they did get some overlapping, when the grandmother was saying the two parents were divorced, and the interpreter's voice perhaps did not go up high enough for the hearing person to know that she was still maintaining her turn. They're divorced, and so I think that the hearing person thought that was the end of the sentence, and it was his turn, when in fact, well, they're divorced, and then going on to talk about the address of the mother. So she did use prosody. The interpreter used prosody in terms of voice signals about when to take turns, for which was culturally appropriate for English. Clearly, when the deaf person is the deaf person was asking a question, then saying, "Do you think, should I bring the children?" So that is the voice up for a question marker, and clearly that signals a turn for the hearing person to provide an answer. When considering other potential controls that might have been used by this interpreter or an interpreter in a similar situation, the one thing I wanted to open with was I can't comment really on the processing time the interpreter was using. Clearly the interpreter is working simultaneously, but at times the ASL interpretation was happening at exactly the same time that the hearing person was saying the words. So I assume that in the video editing that they really synced them up closely, because she must have been mind reading in order to sign that quickly. And the couple of examples I just put down here was around the 6-minute mark. The question about whether do you live in a house or apartment, like she was saying house as he was saying house. So the other one was when he was giving the address for the Attorney General office, and she was interpreting that right on. So I think that I find it hard to believe that her processing time was 1-to-1 for the English to ASL. So in terms of responding, in terms of a possible control to use more processing time or work a little more consecutively, I don't think I'm able to do that, because from what I observed, the tape wasn't representative of the processing time that the interpreter might have been using. Another potential control might be to be more explicit with the hearing person when it's his turn, or when the interpreter is still in process, that the deaf person is still speaking. Obviously, as mentioned earlier, he can't see that the deaf person is signing, whereas live you would see the deaf person signing, so you know something is going on. So other cues that were verbal could be considered. Let me just interpret that, the deaf person still speaking, something like that, to just let him know what's going on, fill in that quiet space. Another control I thought could have been added to the effectiveness of this interpretation is just when the deaf person, when the John Clark was giving his phone number and the interpreter was spelling it, there was a little pause. Just let me get a pen again, or let me write that down. So when he was giving the number, the interpreter could have repeated it so that he knew where she was, or like we do when we take down phone numbers, 780-492, we repeat back as we're taking them down on the paper. So I just thought that was one other English appropriate signal that could be used to help with the exchange of information. I viewed the post-taping interview of the interpreter and was able to learn more about this particular interpreter's controls as characteristics. She's been interpreting well over 20 years, and she indicated that she had been interpreting with video relay services for 6 years or so. She had rich controls around the content, a large fund of information around the legal setting in general. She mentioned that 50% of her work is probably in the legal setting, but very specifically around guardianship. She's interpreted for those kinds of cases in the courts. She's also interpreted for those kinds of cases in Attorney General's offices. And as well, in a previous role that she had with an agency, she had worked with deaf consumers, deaf clients who had guardianship kinds of child support kinds of cases. So she had a lot of controls going into this particular call. Another control was she was very familiar with Austin. She said she was from Austin and this consumer was from Austin. So some of the geography in terms of giving addresses, knowing area codes for phone numbers and that kind of thing would have been a control that she had. She also appeared to be of an age and gender peer of the deaf consumer, similar age. I don't know if the interpreter has grandchildren, but that might have served as a control in this particular setting. I do think that the interpreter's voice for the grandmother, what just turned out to be an amazing match. I could certainly feel like I was hearing the grandmother's voice in that interpreter's voice. When, during the interview, she was asked if she felt any interpersonal demands while managing this call, she revealed that not in terms of the content, but she mentioned there was a demand in managing turn taking, which is inherent in an ongoing demand in working in video relay situations. But unfortunately, this was not really explored in detail in the video. So in my interview questions that I will present to you in text, I did want to try and explore that. I would have liked to have explored that a little bit more with the interpreter, especially given my opportunity to analyze this product from this interpreter. The interpreter also did mention that she did have a general interpersonal demand about working in VRS because she can't see everyone clearly. She can't see the hearing person at all. So she feels she's missing visual cues and body language. And working through a video and a screen to see the deaf person is not quite the same as working with them live. So she says that can create self-doubt. It creates an interpersonal demand about her ability to perform, and she mentioned that her control was to fight that loop, how she phrased it. So she would engage in self-talk. So when the one voice was saying, "What do you think you're doing?" the other one is saying, "You can do this." So it was a pleasure to be able to just learn that about the interpreter during the interview. So I did explore the overlapping demand of the main demand of the overlapping of the speakers. The only other main demand that I observed, but I'm not going to necessarily go through the whole DCCRD given the instructions for this assignment, but the other one was her not understanding a piece of information and her different control options about checking that the information is correct. I felt that she had very strong controls, that her overall message performance was message equivalent when she was experiencing difficulty, and I believe it was exclusively ASL to English where she asked for clarification. There were times when she asked the deaf person for clarification. There were times when she repeated the information to confirm whether it was correct. And there were times when times that she did not reveal this to the hearing speaker, I should say. And there were times when she did. So that just demonstrates to me that this interpreter has quite an array of controls that she can draw upon depending on the cluster and constellation of demands that she's being faced with. So that concludes my presentation of the video relay call dealing with child welfare, and I will submit my interview questions in text. Thank you.